Americans have some pretty negative stereotypes of Canadians. And to be honest, some of them, they really bug me. I let it get to me. I take it as a personal insult. The problem is, though, when so many people are saying these things, then you have to wonder, are some of them true? I'm going to show you a few clips from a recent interview on a well-known channel, which show you exactly what many Americans are saying and also what they think. There's some pretty funny ones too, so some funny stereotypes. They're endearing. Canadians are obsessed with hockey, maple syrup, that we live in the cold, freezing Arctic. And to be fair, 3 months into a hard winter, it might actually feel like that. And there's also the stereotype that Canadians are much more polite than Americans, which I think is really nice. But I think that is probably not as prevalent as it used to be. The elephant in the room here, which I don't want to focus on so much in this video, is about Canada becoming the 51st state. Quickly.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line and you take a look at what that looks like. And it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada.
Now, I'm not making these up. If you've lived and breathed, if you've had any interactions with Americans at all, you would have heard these things before. All the nonsense talk about, again, Canada being the 51st state, it's supercharged some of these stereotypes, and they're being spoken about during interviews and panel interviews, panel discussions, whether it's on podcasts, mainstream media, networks everywhere, all over the US. Americans are not afraid of stating exactly what they think. Now let's get into some of the negative stereotypes. Number one, Canadians are passive and lack assertiveness. Canadians are sometimes seen as too passive or unwilling to stand up for themselves, and that leads to the perception, naturally, that they can be easily pushed around. That's the Canadian way, the nice Canadian way of saying that we're seen as weak. Number two, Canadians have an inferiority complex or are dependent on the US. There's a stereotype that Canada is economically or culturally dependent on the US. We lack our own global influence, and we follow Americans' lead on everything. Number three, Canadians are boring or unadventurous. Some Americans, they view Canadians as dull or lacking excitement, suggesting we live slow, uneventful lives without much ambition or creativity at all. A few years ago, I was at a cultural training conference with a bunch of other police officers from different police services right across the province. And we were sharing stories about cultural awareness, our upbringings, and some of the differences between the countries, some of the differences between the cultures. Well, this one police officer who was born and raised in Jamaica moved to Canada as a teenager and eventually became a police officer. He told a story about how shocked he was to see how spoiled and coddled Canadian kids were. He grew up with very few restrictions, basically left the house in the morning after breakfast and came home for dinner. They explored, built forts, got into fights with one another, caused trouble, things that all kids should experience. And when he moved to Canada, none of his friends that he made at school, none of them were allowed to go out and play like that, to explore the way they were. They were babied and kept safe. They were afraid to leave their boundaries and explore. And he thought this was odd about Canadians. Now, during the discussion, I kind of took exception to this, as I'm sure many of you watching this video also would. And this is no dig to him, okay? He's a great guy, very stand-up man. I still know him. I love him. He's a damn good cop, and we need more like him. These were just his experiences. But that wasn't my upbringing in Canada. That doesn't represent me, my brothers, my friends. I don't know if you've heard, but Canada is a massive country. If you move here from another country and your parents take roots in the middle of the city, then that would probably be your experience as well. That's an exception, but it's not the rule. I grew up climbing trees, exploring abandoned houses and buildings. My family owned farms. We owned property, so we'd be walking around the fields with a pellet gun. Some of us got hurt. We built forts. We got into fights. I probably shouldn't even talk about half the things we did as kids because I'm sure the cops are still looking for us. Now, a lot of that has to do with living in a more rural area, so outside the city. I know farmers personally who they hire help every year. They hire students every summer, and they won't even consider kids from the city. They say that one kid from the country is worth 2 or 3 kids from the city. Now, let me show you this clip from Dave Rubin, the Rubin Report. And I actually really like Dave, but this is from a panel discussion just this past week. So listen to the first guest.
I I am fully opposed to taking over Canada. Why would we want a bunch of libs in some like Arctic wasteland? Like if we're gonna take something over, like Turks and Caicos. I
Well,
mean,
that would be
let
nice.
like be smart here. What do we need Greenland for? I have a list of places we should take over before we take over these frozen, wastelands.
Now, what the heck was that? This is not coming from an uneducated person. She's a weekly columnist at New York Post, Fox News. She's written for USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, and she's a best-selling author. Now, check out this response.
I'm with Carol on this one. I mean, Canada is a socialized nation with 40 million people on socialized healthcare. Who's going to pay for that? Greenland, same thing. All right, 56,000 people. There aren't too many. So it's culturally, people in Canada, people in America say, well, we're going to take over Canada. They're kicking out Trudeau. I'm like, yeah, but they're conservatives are not our, brand of conservative.
Okay, I'll give them that. Not all conservatives are the same. And the same goes with liberals. In some countries, not necessarily Canada and the US, but the terms are almost reversed. Continue.
So no, I don't want to take over Canada. I don't want to absorb 40 million socialists. I don't want to take over Greenland. I don't want to absorb healthcare for 40 million, 56,000 people. These are preposterous proposals that I don't think are ever going to happen.
A land of 40 million socialists? Listen, I don't know much about this guy. He's actually very well spoken. I don't know either of them personally. But what they're saying, you hear these types of opinions echoed everywhere, all over the US. And you can't even really fault people sometimes. If that's the message, or if that's what they've been exposed to over the course of their lifetime, then just like the police officer from Jamaica I mentioned earlier, who only experienced some of what Canadian culture is, you can't even blame them. So a long time ago, I was in my early 20s, okay? I wasn't a cop yet, but I drove to the States to pick up something in Buffalo for my boss, Buffalo, New York. I stopped at a convenience store to grab something, God knows what, and I parked my truck. When I was ready to leave the store, I saw a bunch of guys hanging out around my truck, leaning on it, kind of making it known that they were there, making a point. I had a Canadian flag on the back of my truck because, I usually do on all my vehicles. And of course, my license plate was from Canada. But I knew that the guys were looking for trouble, and it probably wasn't their first rodeo. I was alone. Now, I didn't go out to the truck. I'm not an idiot, okay? Next thing you know, I'm not going to get in a fight in another country. Next thing you know, I'm knocked out. I get jumped in a whole other country and I'm injured. So I waited for them to leave, which they did when the bus came. Even the guy at the convenience store, he commented that Canadians are often robbed in that area because they don't do anything about it and they don't carry weapons. I never told him I was from Canada. He looked at my truck. He knew exactly what was going on. Canada is front and center in conversations right around the world now. People are paying attention everywhere. Our prime minister, he stepped down, so we're going to have an election soon, federal election. We have provincial elections. Every policy is in question. And I hope that in the very near future, Canada is seen as stable and strong and is seen as that lighthouse on the world stage. We're not weak. We don't have an inferiority complex, and we're not boring. With all the changes coming up, there's never been a better time for you to get involved, to make your voice heard. Please share your thoughts on this. I would love to know what you think. Be safe out there, look after one another, and perhaps we will see you again.